Hi guys, my name is Sonora Walton and I will be discussing the literary time period of the 1920s and more specifically the Lost Generation. So the Lost Generation was a group of American writers who came of age during World War I and established their literary reputations in the 1920s. The generation was lost in the sense that its inherited values were no longer relevant in the post-war, and because of its spiritual alienation from a United States that to them seemed hopelessly provincial, materialistic, and emotionally barren. The term embraces Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, E. E. Cummings, Archibald MacLeish, Hart Crane, and many other writers who made Paris the center of their literary activities in the 1920s. Gertrude Stein is credited for the term Lost Generation, though Hemingway made it widely known. In the 1930s, as these writers turned in different directions, their works lost the distinctive stamp of the post-war period. The last representative works of the era were Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, written in 1934, and Dos Passos' The Big Money, written in 1936. We will go on to discuss the psychological issues that were happening at the time of the 1920s. Now, the history of a respective time period helps to shape the intellectual climate of that period. Particular events during a period in history shape the way people think about things and what people are currently thinking about. This clearly impacts the theories that emerge during certain times in history, as well as the general public's attitudes towards certain theories. World War I had just ended in 1918, leaving many military personnel psychologically impacted. Psychologists begin to examine the impact of social dimensions on the mentally ill. In the few short years to follow, Americans would undergo a great deal of social conflict. Strikes, bombings by anarchists, the passage of Prohibition, Palmer raids, and the Red Scare. World War I resulted in more than 9 million deaths. Many of the writers from this generation were forced to fight in the war, resulting in major psychological trauma, affecting the future literature of this generation. They lost something because of the war, hence the term, the Lost Generation. The quote, you are all a lost generation from Hemingway referred to the lack of purpose or drive resulting from the horrific disillusionment felt by those who grew up and lived through the war, and were then in their 20s and 30s by the end of it. Having seen pointless death on such a huge scale, many lost faith in traditional values like courage, patriotism, and masculinity. The best examples are in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby, with the idealization of Daisy. Gatsby's inability to see her as she truly is a result from the psychological trauma that he became upon after the war. Now we go on to the social conflicts that were happening at the time. During the 1920s, the Great Migration of African Americans from the southern countryside to northern cities were happening, and the increasing visibility of black culture was emerging. Jazz music and blues music, for example, and the literary movement known as the Harlem Renaissance discomfited some white Americans. The spirit of protest was especially strong in serious American writing during the 1920s. Many of the greatest writers of this period hated the new business culture. One such writer was Sinclair Lewis. He was the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Lewis wrote about Americans living in the towns and villages in the central part of the United States. Many of the people in his books were foolish men and women with empty values. They chased after money and popularity. In his famous book Main Street, Lewis joked about and criticized small-town business owners. Social criticism was also essential to the writing of the newspaper writer H.L. Mencken from the eastern city of Baltimore. Mencken considered most Americans to be stupid and violent fools. He attacked their values without mercy. Of course, many traditional Americans reacted strongly to such criticism. These conflicts were what one historian has called a cultural civil war between city dwellers and small-town residents, Protestants and Catholics, blacks and whites. New women such as flappers and advocates of old-fashioned family values are perhaps the most important part of the story of the Roaring Twenties. We continue on to the cultural issues that were also happening at the time that were very similar to the social issues as well. The Harlem Renaissance was a flourishing of African American art, music, literature, and poetry centered in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. This movement was generated by a group of African American writers famous for the stories and depictions of black culture and experience. Zora Neale Hurston, County Cullen, and Langston Hughes were among the most famous African American authors associated with this movement. African Americans also dominated the jazz scene in the 1920s. Duke Ellington, who frequently performed at the Cotton Club, was one of the most influential jazz band leaders and composers of all time. It created music and dance that all Americans began to enjoy in local speakeasies and juke joints. Other movements in the 1920s were fueled by Marcus Garvey. Garvey created the UNIA that promoted black business and encouraging blacks to leave America for Africa. Movements in black art and literature were also observed through this decade. As seen in the Harlem Renaissance, this movement was created by a group of African American writers famous for their stories and depictions of black culture and experience. The Roaring Twenties, however, screeched to a halt on October 29, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, when the collapse of stock prices on Wall Street ushered in the period of U.S. history known as the Great Depression. Now, there were political issues happening at the time of the 1920s that sparked many famous writers to create some of the best literature pieces. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1919, had banned the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors, and at 12 a.m. on January 16, 1920, the Federal Volstead Act closed every tavern, bar, and saloon in the United States. During the years these novels were written, however, the sale of alcohol was illegal in America. In Fitzgerald's most famous novel, The Great Gatsby, the nuances of the plot are tied together with national prohibition and the ways in which individuals sought to escape the legal confines of what many Americans considered to be an absurd moral intrusion into their lives. As a result, alcohol and its prohibition became a literary topic not just for Fitzgerald, but for many authors who wrote and published between 1920 and 1933, which was also known as the American Dry Years. Now, religion wasn't as big of an issue as such things like political prohibition and the Harlem Renaissance, but it did affect some writers of the lost generation. During the 1920s, religion changed quite a bit. It all started when new scientific discoveries were being made, causing more people to believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. Fundamentalism versus modernism was a giant argument in faith and science during the time. These movements were basically arguing whether religion should be taught in school, and fundamentalists thought that they should, versus should it be evolution taught in school, and modernism thought that it should. Ernest Hemingway was one of the members of the lost generation who wrote about religion at this time. Big Two-Hearted River was first published in 1925 and appeared in Hemingway's collection of short stories In Our Time. Most people are aware that Hemingway served in Italy in World War I. He was an ambulance driver, and he also worked as a certain corpsman who delivered food, drinks, and cigarettes to soldiers at the front. On July 18, 1918, Hemingway was severely wounded by mortar fragments and machine gun rounds. Hemingway recounted that he felt his soul or something coming right out of his body, like you'd pull a silk handkerchief out of one pocket by one corner. No one can know the true depth or sincerity of anyone's faith, yet it is still likely that Hemingway's exploration of Catholicism never really achieved the fullness of faith. Hemingway was certainly attracted to the Catholic intellectual and aesthetic tradition. However, Hemingway was aware that religious influence had major power over modern art. During the 1920s, many Americans had extra money to spend, and they spent it on consumer goods such as ready-to-wear clothes and home appliances like electric refrigerators. In particular, they bought radios. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. The achievement of material affluence became a goal for many U.S. citizens, as well as an object of satire and ridicule for the writers and intellectuals of the lost generation. As previously discussed, F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby is a great example of one of the best works of literature to come out of the 1920s. He discusses psychological, social, cultural, and economic issues in the novel. The economic issues are mainly based around this image that the new America is rich. They throw lavish parties, buy clothes from other countries, and spend money like it will never run out, because the idea that economic prosperity will be there forever. In summary, I just have one question. Why is this so important? Well, at the time, writers were challenging what they thought to be true. At one point in their lives before the war, they thought they knew what life was about. Yet when they come back, they seem to be lost and damaged, and they start questioning everyone. Many risks were being taken at the time. Boundaries were being pushed, and they had created this influence over modern writing, and they are still a big influence today. That is why the Lost Generation and the literary time period of the 1920s is so important. Thank you.